It began quietly, almost unnoticed by most Americans. The world beyond their borders was already burning. Hitler's armies had marched into Poland, the skies over Europe thundered with bombers, and distant radio voices spoke of chaos and invasion. But in the small towns of Ohio, in the crowded streets of New York, and on the farmlands of Kansas, life went on as usual. People read the headlines, shook their heads, and turned the page. The wounds of the First World War still ached in memory, and the Great Depression had barely loosened its grip. America, weary of blood and broken dreams, wanted peace above all else. In those years, the word war felt like something foreign, something that happened somewhere else. The government's policy reflected the sentiment. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts, designed to keep the nation out of foreign conflicts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the world was changing, but the American heartland had no appetite for another European war. Isolationism wasn't just a policy, it was a promise to stay safe behind oceans and faith in distance. Mothers remembered their sons who never came home from the trenches in 1918. Fathers, still struggling to find steady work after the Depression, wanted stability, not sacrifice. Yet, far away across the Atlantic and the Pacific, dark clouds were gathering. Germany's rise under Adolf Hitler was no longer a distant European matter. His speeches echoed across the world, promising dominance and revenge. Japan, ambitious and restless, looked toward Asia and the Pacific with hungry eyes. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist banners fluttered over parades and invasions. The axis of aggression was forming, and Roosevelt saw the storm before most others did. Even as Americans bought new radios and flocked to movie theaters to escape reality, Roosevelt began preparing silently. Factories were asked to prepare for the possibility of rearmament. Ships were built quietly in shipyards, though officially they were for defense. The president, with his cigarette holder and calm confidence, addressed the nation through his famous fireside chats, reminding citizens that democracy must be defended even if danger felt far away. But many Americans didn't agree. No more foreign wars, they said. Let Europe handle its own troubles. The scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of losing another generation was stronger than any distant ideal. In 1939, when the war officially began in Europe, America stood apart watching, listening, calculating. The fall of France in 1940 sent shockwaves across the world. Britain now stood alone against Nazi power. Roosevelt faced a divided nation, one half urging aid to Britain, the other shouting for neutrality. Slowly, cautiously, he began to shift gears. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the United States to supply Britain and other allies with weapons, food, and materials not as charity, but as a loan. It was a clever political move, a way to help without fighting. Factories that had once built cars now began to produce airplanes and tanks. America's sleeping industrial giants stirred. Still, life at home seemed normal. Baseball games filled the summer air, swing music ruled the radio, and Hollywood kept the spirits high with dreams of glamour. But beneath the surface, anxiety was rising. Newsreels before movies showed cities being bombed in Europe, families whispered about what if it comes here. Some began to enlist voluntarily, others joined the newly formed civil defense groups. Roosevelt, elected for an unprecedented third term in 1940, reassured the nation that he would keep them safe, but even he knew that the Atlantic and Pacific were not strong enough walls anymore. And then came December 7, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii turned into fire and thunder. Japanese planes swooped over Pearl Harbor, dropping bombs that tore through battleships and barracks. In a few hours, over 2,400 Americans were dead. The smoke that rose from the harbor wasn't just from burning ships, it was the end of America's distance from the war. That day, President Roosevelt's calm voice trembled with fury as he called it a date which will live in infamy. The next morning, the United States declared war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America. For ordinary Americans, the change was instant. Radios that had once played dance music now delivered war bulletins. Posters appeared overnight urging citizens to do your part. Young men lined up outside recruitment offices, unsure of where they might be sent but certain that they must go. Mothers held back tears as they watched their sons march away in uniforms. Life, once ordinary and predictable, was transformed in a heartbeat. Factories that had been half idle since the Depression now roared to life 24 hours a day. Towns that had known only small businesses became industrial centers overnight. Women stepped forward to fill the empty spaces men left behind. The nation was suddenly awake, alert, united, fueled by anger and purpose. But in that first moment after Pearl Harbor, before the unity and industry and sacrifice, there was shock, deep, shaking disbelief. Newspapers sold out in minutes. People gathered around radios in silence, listening to reports from Hawaii. Rumors flew of invasion, of sabotage, of spies. Japanese American communities across the West Coast faced suspicion and fear. The war had come home, and it came with confusion as much as courage. For a generation that had grown up in hardship, this new crisis felt both terrifying and inevitable. The Depression had taught them endurance, now they would need strength. Fathers who once struggled to find work now found themselves needed again, building planes, tanks, and ships. Teenagers dreamed not of college or careers, but of uniforms and medals. Women who had been confined to homes or small jobs began to imagine something larger, a role in rebuilding and defending the country they loved. In that winter of 1941, America stood at the edge of transformation. The war had shattered its illusion of safety, but it had also ignited something powerful: unity. The same citizens who once turned the page on European headlines were now ready to write their own. Across small towns and cities, people hung flags in their windows, joined drives for scrap metal, and vowed to fight for freedom everywhere. The storm that America had tried so hard to avoid had arrived, fierce and unforgiving. Yet, beneath the fear and grief, there was resolve. The nation was no longer watching history, it was becoming it. The factories, the soldiers, the mothers, the children, all would play their part in what would soon be called the greatest conflict in human history. But on that December night, as radio static filled the air and the president's voice echoed through living rooms, one truth settled into every American heart: the world would never be the same again. The Arsenal of Democracy, 1942 to 1943. When the echoes of Pearl Harbor faded, they were replaced by the deep hum of factories, the clanging of steel, and the rhythmic march of determination. Across the vast expanse of America, the sound of war had arrived not only on the front lines but in every city, street, and rural field. The country that had once stood hesitant was now moving with relentless energy. Within months, America had begun to transform into something entirely new, an industrial and human machine driven by unity, fear, and an unshakable belief in victory. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" became the nation's heartbeat. President Roosevelt had used it months before the attack, urging Americans to produce enough weapons and supplies to defend not only their nation but the free world itself. Now those words were no longer a speech, they were a command. Car factories in Detroit stopped making shiny convertibles and started building tanks and jeeps. Aircraft plants rose out of empty farmland. The Ford Motor Company, once known for the Model T, now rolled out bomber planes on assembly lines designed for speed, not style. The hands that once polished chrome were now tightening bolts on engines of war. It was as if the country's veins were suddenly filled with electricity. Cities that had been quiet during the Depression turned into roaring furnaces of productivity. Smoke rose over the skyline of Pittsburgh as steel poured for ships and weapons. In California, the shipyards worked day and night, the glow of welding torches lighting the night sky like stars. Every piece of machinery, every ounce of fuel, every pound of food became part of a single mission. The American worker had become a soldier in overalls. And then there were the women. When millions of men left to fight, the empty spaces in factories and offices could no longer stay empty. Women stepped forward, mothers, wives, sisters, daughters, trading aprons for uniforms and typewriters for drills. They wore bandanas over their hair, grease on their hands, and pride in their hearts. Rosie the Riveter, the poster woman with the rolled-up sleeve, became a national symbol. Her words, "We can do it," weren't just a slogan, they were a promise. Women who had never imagined life outside their homes found themselves building airplanes, operating heavy machinery, and managing offices. It wasn't just about earning a wage, it was about belonging to something larger. In cafeterias and factory floors, women of all races worked side by side, though segregation still shadowed their progress. For the first time, American women weren't just supporting the war, they were powering it. Many faced long hours, harsh conditions, and unequal pay, but their resilience gave the home front its strength. When their husbands and sons wrote letters from distant battlefields, the women replied not with tears, but with determination, "We're doing our part here, too." Everywhere, the rhythm of war shaped daily life. Gasoline was rationed, tires were scarce, sugar and coffee were counted by coupons. Yet people accepted these restrictions almost proudly. Families planted victory gardens in their backyards, growing vegetables so that more food could go to soldiers. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and old newspapers for recycling drives. Neighbors organized blackouts, practiced air raid drills, and learned to live by the dim glow of ration lamps. Even entertainment became patriotic. Movie theaters showed newsreels of the front before every film, and radio programs blended music with messages of courage. The propaganda machine worked around the clock. Posters covered walls, urging thrift, silence, and loyalty. Loose lips sink ships, save fuel for the fight, buy war bonds. The Office of War Information crafted stories that made every American feel like part of the struggle. Newspapers carried images of smiling soldiers and heroic workers. The government knew that morale was as important as bullets, and it succeeded. Patriotism was no longer abstract, it was a daily ritual, measured in effort and sacrifice. But not every story was one of unity. In the shadows of progress lay injustice. After Pearl Harbor, fear and suspicion had turned toward Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Families who had lived in America for generations were suddenly branded as potential spies. Executive Order 9066 forced over 100,000 people, men, women, and children, to leave their homes and live in internment camps behind barbed wire. They sold their businesses for pennies, left behind farms, schools, and friends. In the cold barracks of those camps, guarded by soldiers, they waited and wondered what freedom truly meant. The government called it military necessity, but history would later call it shame. Still, the American spirit refused to fracture completely. Despite hardship, most citizens clung to hope. They wrote letters to soldiers, sent care packages, and listened to radio broadcasts from overseas. For many families, the war wasn't just on the front lines, it was in their kitchens, in their empty chairs, in every quiet prayer before bed. Mothers hung blue stars in their windows for each son serving in uniform. A gold star meant he would never come home. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's government mobilized the nation like never before. The War Production Board directed industries, deciding what would be built and where. The Selective Service System drafted millions into the military. Taxes rose, but few complained. People knew the money was fueling victory. Celebrities joined bond drives, and every citizen was reminded that even a few dollars could help a soldier survive another day. By late 1943, the transformation was astonishing. America was producing more planes, ships, and weapons than all the Axis powers combined. The nation's industrial might had become the backbone of the Allied effort. Roosevelt's words had come true. The United States was not just fighting a war, it was building one. Behind every bullet fired on a distant battlefield, behind every tank rolling through Europe, there were the unseen hands of millions of Americans back home. Yet even amid the triumph, the cost was visible. Accidents in factories claimed lives. Long hours broke bodies. Families grew apart under the pressure of endless work and worry. The letters from the front carried both pride and pain. "Keep the home fires burning," soldiers wrote. "We're counting on you." And so the people worked harder, longer, refusing to let fear dull their resolve. As 1943 turned toward 1944, the horizon began to shift. The first whispers of Allied victories arrived. North Africa reclaimed, Italy invaded, Europe preparing for liberation. In every factory whistle and every newspaper headline, Americans could feel it, they were turning the tide. But they also knew the worst was yet to come. Somewhere across the sea, millions of their sons would face battles that no machine could win alone. Back home, the arsenal of democracy had done its job. The country that once doubted its strength had proven its power. But more than the tanks or planes, it was the people, the workers, the women, the families who had become the true arsenal. They had forged not only weapons, but courage. They had learned to endure blackouts, loss, and fear, and still keep moving forward. America was no longer the hesitant observer it had been just 2 years before. It was a nation transformed, united by effort, tested by sacrifice, and steeled for victory. The factories still roared, the posters still urged, and the stars in the windows still gleamed. The war was far from over, but the soul of America had already changed forever. War and the Home Front, 1943 to 1945. By 1943, the war had become a rhythm that pulsed through every American life. It was no longer something that had begun suddenly, or something that would end soon. It was an ever-present force, shaping every conversation, every meal, every dream. The front lines stretched across oceans, but the war lived in the quiet of kitchens, in the hum of factories, in the empty seats at dinner tables. It had become the air America breathed. Soldiers rode home from deserts, jungles, and frozen battlefields, their letters censored, folded, and passed through trembling hands. "I'm fine," they wrote, even when they weren't. "Tell Mom not to worry." The letters were short, sometimes stained with dirt or tears, but to the families waiting in small towns and crowded cities, they were everything. Mothers saved each one in boxes, tied together with ribbon. Children would listen as their father's words were read aloud in trembling voices, imagining the distant lands described, Italy's ruined villages, France's muddy roads, islands where palm trees burned instead of swayed. At home, people tried to hold on to normalcy, but normal had changed. The sound of train whistles carried soldiers away each morning. Blackout curtains covered windows at night, and the radio became the nation's heartbeat, a lifeline of music, news, and hope. Popular songs like "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree" and "I'll Be Seeing You" filled living rooms with bittersweet warmth. Families gathered close around the crackling speakers, praying for good news. Life on the home front demanded endurance. Ration books dictated every purchase: meat, butter, sugar, gasoline. Housewives learned to stretch every meal, reusing bacon grease, baking with substitutes, and turning leftovers into new dishes. The smell of coffee was a rare comfort, a single bag had to last weeks. Children collected tin cans and old tires for recycling drives, proudly announcing they were helping the boys overseas. In backyards, victory gardens bloomed, small plots of hope sprouting beans and carrots where flower beets once were. Factories, once symbols of progress, now resembled battlefields of their own. Men and women worked 12-hour shifts under blinding lights, their faces smeared with oil, their bodies aching from endless repetition. They built planes faster than anyone thought possible, rolled tanks off assembly lines like clockwork, and stitched parachutes by the thousands. Accidents were common, sleep was scarce, but no one complained. Every spark that flew, every whistle that blew, felt like another step toward victory. The war had also begun to reshape hearts and minds. African American soldiers fought bravely overseas, even as segregation and prejudice followed them into the military camps. The Tuskegee Airmen, the first black pilots in U.S. history, proved their courage in the skies of Europe, their red-tailed planes slicing through enemy lines. Back home, black workers demanded fair pay and respect in war industries. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph pushed the government to address racial inequality, forcing Roosevelt to sign an order banning discrimination in defense jobs. For many, this war wasn't only against fascism abroad, it was a battle for justice at home. Women, too, began to feel the weight and promise of change. Those who had stepped into factories during the early war years now carried full responsibility as workers, mothers, and citizens. They led blood drives, joined the Red Cross, volunteered at hospitals, and organized fundraisers. Some joined the Women's Army Corps or the Navy's Waves, taking on communications, mechanics, and medical roles once reserved for men. The war had given them purpose, but also a question: when peace returned, would they be asked to return to their kitchens? Even in moments of exhaustion, humor found its way through. Soldiers sent jokes on postcards, radio comedians made people laugh through blackouts. Hollywood became a weapon of morale. Films like Casablanca and Mrs. Miniver told stories of courage, sacrifice, and love surviving in wartime. Movie theaters offered more than entertainment, they were sanctuaries from anxiety. The flicker of the projector light was a reminder that beauty could still exist amid destruction. Still, the war took its toll. Telegrams delivered by uniformed messengers brought heartbreak to countless doorsteps. "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you," those words became every mother's nightmare. Neighborhoods grew quieter each time a gold star appeared in a window, marking a life lost. Yet even grief became a form of strength. Communities gathered around the bereaved, cooking meals, offering shoulders to cry on. They told themselves, and each other, that the fallen had not died in vain. The war's reach extended even into science and secrecy. In hidden labs scattered across the country, scientists worked under the cloak of silence on something unprecedented: the Manhattan Project. Most Americans knew nothing of it, only that vast sums of money were vanishing into remote deserts and mountains. Inside, the brightest minds of the era, from Oppenheimer to Fermi, were building a weapon unlike any other. It was born from fear, the fear that Germany might create it first, but it would soon become the force that would end everything. By 1944, the tide was finally turning. The Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, in what would become the largest invasion in history. Radios crackled with updates as families leaned close, holding their breath. Many didn't know if their loved ones were among the thousands storming those beaches. Weeks later, when news came that Paris had been liberated, church bells rang across America. Factories paused for a minute of celebration, then went back to work because the war still raged in the Pacific. On the home front, hope was tempered with exhaustion. Families had lived under the strain of absence and rationing for years. But something stronger than fatigue kept them moving, a belief that the sacrifices meant something, that the world being rebuilt would be safer and freer. As Christmas 1944 arrived, people prayed not for gifts but for peace. Packages were sent overseas filled with homemade cookies, knitted socks, and photographs from home. Soldiers received them weeks later, holding those small tokens like treasures. Then came 1945. The snow was melting when the first whispers of Germany's collapse reached America. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was ending. Crowds filled Times Square, waving flags, kissing strangers, and crying openly. For a moment, the world felt lighter. But the Pacific still burned. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown the cost of victory: thousands dead, cities reduced to rubble. And then, in August, a new kind of dawn broke. The atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki, unleashing power beyond imagination. The war ended soon after, but the world that emerged was forever altered. Back home, celebrations erupted: parades, confetti, laughter that sounded almost unfamiliar after years of fear. Yet beneath the joy, there was grief too deep to measure. The soldiers returning home were heroes, but they carried invisible scars. The families who had waited would never be quite the same. The war had bound the nation together, but it had also taken something from everyone. As the victory banners came down and factories grew quiet again, America stood at a crossroads. The war had forged unity and strength, but it had also awakened questions about equality, peace, and power. The home front had endured hunger, loneliness, and loss, yet from that endurance had grown a new kind of hope. They had built planes and bombs, yes, but they had also built resilience. By the end of 1945, the war was over, but its echo remained in every heartbeat, every memory, every photograph framed on a mantelpiece. The people who had lived through those years had seen the worst of humanity and the best of themselves. A new America, 1945 and beyond. The war had ended, but silence didn't come easily. After years of gunfire and sirens, the quiet of peace felt strange, almost fragile. In the late summer of 1945, America found itself suspended between exhaustion and triumph. Flags hung from every porch, the newspapers screamed victory, and crowds filled the streets. Yet behind the parades and the cheers, there was something unspoken, a sense that the world they had known before the war was gone, and a new one was beginning to take shape. When the soldiers came home, they stepped off trains to a chorus of applause and tears. Mothers ran to embrace sons they hadn't seen in years. Children clung to fathers who looked older, quieter, hardened by memories they couldn't share. Some came home with medals, others came home with scars that didn't show. The nation that welcomed them had changed. Women were working in factories, technology had leaped forward, and cities pulsed with energy. The men who had once fought for normal life now returned to find normality itself redefined. In small towns, factory whistles that had once signaled war production now marked new beginnings. The assembly line slowed, then shifted, tanks became tractors, bombers became passenger planes, and the same workers who had built weapons began building the tools of peace. There was relief, yes, but also uncertainty. What would peace mean after such destruction? For some, it meant going back to school under the new GI Bill. For others, it meant buying a home in a growing suburb, starting a family, and chasing a quieter dream. The nation that had mobilized for war was now mobilizing for prosperity. The GI Bill changed everything. Millions of veterans poured into colleges and universities, men who had once fought in Europe and the Pacific now sitting in classrooms, notebooks in hand. They studied engineering, medicine, law, agriculture, building the foundation of a modern America. The bill also made it possible for families to own homes with low-interest loans. Suburbs blossomed like new cities, rows of identical houses with green lawns and white fences, symbols of stability after chaos. The American dream wasn't just a phrase anymore, it was being built, one house at a time. But beneath the optimism lay deeper currents. The women who had worked during the war now faced a choice, or rather, a push. Many were told to leave their jobs so returning soldiers could take them back. Some accepted it with resignation, others with quiet defiance. They had tasted independence, felt the pride of earning their own wages, and proved that they could do more than anyone had ever believed. Though many returned to domestic life, they carried with them the confidence that would fuel the women's rights movements of the decades to come. The racial tensions that had surfaced during the war did not vanish with peace. Black veterans returned home expecting equality after fighting for freedom abroad, only to find segregation waiting for them at home. They had marched under the same flag as their white comrades, but the democracy they defended still denied them basic rights. The contradiction burned deeply. In the years that followed, their voices grew louder. The war had planted the seeds of change, and soon, they would take root in the civil rights movement that reshaped the nation. Economically, America emerged from the war stronger than ever before. The factories that once produced weapons now supplied the world with goods. Europe lay in ruins, Asia was rebuilding, and America became the supplier, the lender, the model of modernity. The dollar became the currency of stability, the American brand became a symbol of recovery. The Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe's reconstruction, and in doing so, cemented America's place as a global leader. But with great power came a new kind of fear. The atomic bomb that had ended the war also cast a long shadow. Newsreels of Hiroshima's devastation haunted the public imagination. The bomb had brought victory, but also a terrible question: what if someone else built one too? Within months, tensions with the Soviet Union began to grow. The alliance forged during the war cracked into suspicion and rivalry. The world had entered a new era, the Cold War, and America found itself facing a different kind of enemy, ideology, not invasion. Back home, daily life tried to settle into routine, yet the war's fingerprints were everywhere. Radios gave way to televisions, and the faces of generals and presidents now appeared in living rooms. Children who had known nothing but war grew up in a world of peace tinged with nuclear anxiety. Air raid drills replaced blackout curtains, and phrases like duck and cover entered school vocabularies. Science had triumphed, but it had also frightened. Still, progress marched forward. Medical discoveries born from wartime research began saving lives. The jet engine revolutionized travel, connecting continents that had once felt distant. Factories that had employed millions of workers now produced cars and appliances that defined modern living. It was a paradox, a world rebuilt from destruction, where comfort was both reward and distraction. People bought televisions, refrigerators, and new cars with chrome grills that gleamed like trophies. America was entering its golden age, even as shadows lingered at its edges. Culturally, the nation began to redefine itself. Jazz and swing gave way to new sounds, early rock and roll, voices that spoke to a generation unshaped by depression or battle. Hollywood flourished again, this time telling stories not of war but of romance, ambition, and rebellion. The soldiers of the 40s became the fathers of the 50s, building lives that seemed ordinary but carried the quiet weight of memory. They didn't talk much about what they'd seen. They didn't have to. It was written in the way they looked at the flag, or stood in silence during the national anthem. In Washington, Roosevelt's death in 1945 had marked the end of an era. Harry Truman, once a quiet senator, now carried the burden of leadership in a world both victorious and volatile. He oversaw not just the end of one war, but the beginning of another, a battle of influence, technology, and fear. Yet even amid the political storms, America's faith in itself remained unshaken. It believed in its own promise, in the strength that had carried it through the darkest years. By the early 1950s, America stood at the height of power. It was no longer the uncertain nation of 1939, hesitant to engage with the world. It was now the world's guardian, builder, and symbol of hope. Its soldiers were stationed across continents, its industries fueled global recovery, and its ideals, freedom, democracy, opportunity, became the language of leadership. But for the millions of ordinary Americans who had lived through the war, the measure of victory wasn't in flags or headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the laughter of children playing in peaceful neighborhoods, the hum of a refrigerator, the steady pay of a job, the letters that no longer began with "My dearest from overseas." The war had ended, but its legacy endured in every heartbeat of the nation it transformed. America had entered the conflict reluctant and uncertain, and emerged from it powerful and self-assured. Yet beneath that confidence lay remembrance of loss, of courage, of unity. The people who had built bombers and victory gardens, who had waded through years of rationing and fear, had proven something extraordinary, that democracy, when tested, could not only survive, it could rebuild the world. And so, as the sun set on the first peaceful decade after the storm, America stood tall, not untouched by tragedy, but strengthened by it. A new era had begun, one born not from conquest, but from endurance. The nation that had once looked inward now looked outward, carrying with it the lessons of sacrifice and hope. The arsenal of democracy had become the architect of peace. And from the ashes of war, a new America had risen, vibrant, restless, and forever changed.